Jack Turner's farm had always been his sanctuary, a sprawling, sunlit homestead on the outskirts of Willow Creek that had been in his family for generations. The old farmhouse, with its wraparound porch and creaking wooden floors, was more than just a building. It was the heart of his legacy. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight bathed the fields in gold, Jack would rise with purpose. Whether tending to his prize cattle, mending fences, or harvesting crops, every task was a tribute to the traditions passed down from his forefathers. Jack, a rugged former military man turned full-time rancher, prided himself on his self-reliance and the simple life he'd built. He reveled in the freedom of rural living, the taste of fresh air, and the satisfaction of a job well done. His farm was not only his livelihood, it was his identity. Each acre of tilled soil, each animal he cared for, symbolized the hard work and determination that had sustained his family through tough times. But recent months had brought an unwelcome intrusion into this peaceful existence. Rumors had been swirling about an overzealous homeowners association, HOA, that sought to impose its modern, uniform standards on every property in Willow Creek, regardless of history or character. At the center of this bureaucratic blitz was Kerren Miller, a self-appointed enforcer known throughout the community for her strict adherence to arbitrary rules. Always immaculately dressed in crisp skirts and high heels, with a clipboard clutched as if it were a scepter, Kerren saw herself as the guardian of community aesthetics and order. The first sparks of conflict flared on a sweltering summer afternoon. Jack had been busy supervising the harvest of his crops when he noticed an unusual gathering near his farm's entrance. To his shock, a group of well-dressed individuals had set up tables and decorations on his property. A wedding reception, complete with a lavish buffet and twinkling fairy lights, was underway. At the center of it all stood Kerren, smiling smugly as she oversaw every detail. "Jack," Kerren proclaimed, her tone both sweet and imperious, "our community values uniformity and order. Your property, as charming as it is, does not meet the required standards for hosting community events. Since you've neglected to seek prior approval, the HOA has taken the liberty of hosting this wedding here for the benefit of everyone." Jack's heart pounded with indignation. His farm was his pride and joy, every inch of it managed with care and love. "Kerren, you can't just commandeer my property for your events without asking," he retorted. "This isn't a community park. It's my home, my livelihood. I work hard for every crop and every animal, and I won't let you, or the HOA, trample on my rights." Kerren, unfazed, produced a final warning notice from her clipboard. "The rules apply to everyone, Jack. If you don't comply with the HOA's standards, further action will be taken." Her words, cool and unyielding, sent a shiver through the gathered onlookers who had witnessed the confrontation. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the farmhouse lights flickered on, Jack sat on his porch with a heavy heart. The wedding reception, impeccably set up on his lawn, was a blatant violation of his privacy and a challenge to his long-held rights as a property owner. Determined not to let this injustice slide, Jack vowed that he would defend his home and his legacy at any cost. The battle lines were drawn, a man committed to preserving his heritage versus an entitled bureaucrat intent on imposing her rules by force. The morning after the unauthorized wedding, Jack awoke to a grim sight. An official envelope, stamped with the HOA's seal, was taped to his farmhouse door. With a deep sense of foreboding, he opened it to reveal a $750 fine for violating community event regulations, a thinly veiled punishment for the wedding that had been hosted on his property without permission. The notice was crammed with legalese and warnings of further penalties if he did not comply with the HOA standards. Before Jack could fully absorb the contents, he stepped outside to find Kerren waiting near the driveway. Standing with arms crossed and an air of unassailable authority, she said, "Good morning, Jack. I trust you've read the notice. The rules are clear. If you don't bring your property into compliance, additional fines and enforcement actions will follow." Jack's response was measured but resolute. "Kerren, my farm is my home, and I've run it the same way my family always has. I don't need you imposing your arbitrary rules on me or my property." His tone conveyed years of experience and a refusal to be bullied. Unperturbed, Kerren replied, "The rules apply to everyone, Jack. Your non-compliance affects the entire community, and I will not hesitate to take further action." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jack simmering with indignation. Later that morning, as Jack patrolled the perimeter of his property, he noticed a nondescript van parked near the entrance. Two inspectors in official uniform stepped out, clipboards in hand, and began a meticulous survey of his property. They measured the layout of his yard, took photographs of his farmhouse and wedding decorations still left behind, and noted every detail as if his life were a case study in nonconformity. Jack's loyal dogs barked at the intruders, and he quickly activated his security system. Determined to defend his property, he snapped photos and recorded videos of the inspectors at work, logging every detail in his well-worn notebook. Each piece of evidence was a silent declaration. His home was his own, and he would not allow the HOA to trample on his rights. That afternoon, in the quiet of his barn office, Jack compiled all his evidence into a comprehensive dossier. He drafted a formal complaint to the local zoning office, citing long-standing agricultural exemptions and property rights that protected him from such arbitrary enforcement. His complaint was both a legal challenge and a proud proclamation that his property would remain under his control, untainted by the invasive rules of an entitled bureaucracy. Word of the fine and the intrusive inspection spread quickly through Cedar Valley. At local feed stores and community gatherings, neighbors began whispering about similar experiences with the HOA. A collective sense of injustice was awakening among property owners who, like Jack, cherished their independence. As dusk settled and the first stars twinkled overhead, Kerren reappeared at Jack's property. Under the soft glow of a porch light, she delivered an ultimatum. "Jack, you have 48 hours to bring your property into compliance or face additional penalties." Her tone was cold and absolute, leaving no room for debate. Jack's reply was calm but firm. "I'll continue to manage my farm the way I always have. My property is my legacy, and I won't let you dictate how I live." With that, he closed the door on another day of escalating conflict, knowing that the battle for his home was just beginning. In the days following Kerren's ultimatum, the harassment at Jack's farm escalated alarmingly. What started as a fine and intrusive inspection soon became part of a broader campaign to assert control over private property. Neighbors whispered that Kerren had been trespassing on various properties without permission, and that she had even taken firewood and other resources from local farms. Rumors spread that she'd gone as far as attempting to milk one of Jack's prize roosters during the unauthorized wedding, a claim that enraged property owners across Cedar Valley. One overcast afternoon, while Jack was repairing a section of his fence, his longtime neighbor, Sam, pulled up beside him. "Jack, you're not the only one being targeted," Sam confided in a low voice. "I've heard that Kerren's been parking her car on private driveways, trespassing on properties, and even taking items without asking. People are fed up, and there's talk that the fines are just a cover for her personal greed." Sam's words struck a deep chord in Jack. The idea that Kerren would stoop so low as to steal from hard-working ranchers was intolerable. Determined to expose the full extent of the HOA's corruption, Jack began a covert investigation. He made discreet trips to the county clerk's office to examine HOA records, attended board meetings incognito, and recorded whispered conversations among frustrated neighbors. Every piece of evidence painted a damning picture. Kerren was abusing her power to control property owners and enrich herself, not to protect the community. Late one stormy night, as rain lashed against the barn and lightning illuminated the dark skies, Jack pored over photocopies of ledger entries and anonymous notes. He compiled a detailed dossier documenting irregularities in the HOA's practices, mysterious deductions from fines, unexplained transfers, and even forged documents. With each new piece of evidence, his resolve hardened. This wasn't just about a single incident. It was a systematic abuse of power that needed to be halted. Word of Jack's investigation began to circulate through Cedar Valley. At a secret meeting in the back room of a local feed store, several aggrieved property owners recounted their own experiences with invasive inspections and arbitrary fines. An elderly farmer tearfully described how a minor deviation in the arrangement of firewood had led to a crippling fine, while another admitted that he'd been forced to pay voluntary contributions that never reached any communal fund. The collective outrage was palpable, and Jack's dossier became a rallying point for those determined to resist the HOA's tyranny. Determined to fortify his property, Jack upgraded his security system, installing additional high-definition cameras along the perimeter and logging every instance of trespassing. His loyal dogs patrolled the grounds, serving as both guardians and a reminder that his land was not for public use. Every detail was captured and recorded, ready to be used as evidence in the battle for justice. Under the pressure of these mounting threats, Kerren's tactics grew even more aggressive. In a series of curt, official letters, she warned that any further noncompliance would result in severe penalties, including the possibility of legal action to seize portions of privately owned land. The oppressive weight of her threats rippled through the community, and it became clear that if this abuse continued, no one would be safe from her arbitrary interference. One particularly stormy night, as thunder rumbled overhead, Jack reviewed his dossier one final time. The evidence was overwhelming, and he resolved that it was time to take his case public. With determination burning in his eyes, he reached out to local journalists, handing over copies of records, photographs, and video footage that documented every transgression by Kerren and her cronies. Standing in the rain-soaked darkness outside his farmhouse, Jack vowed that he would no longer tolerate the violation of his rights. This battle was not just about a stolen prize rooster or a commandeered wedding. It was about protecting the legacy of his property and ensuring that every homeowner in Cedar Valley could live without arbitrary interference. The simmering conflict reached its zenith one sweltering morning when Jack arrived at his farm to find an outrageous scene. Kerren had hosted a wedding on his property without permission. Tables were set up along his front lawn, and a lavish buffet, with an elegant cake and twinkling lights, had been arranged as if his land were a community park. Guests mingled and celebrated, completely oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing on private property. Jack's blood boiled at the sight. Not only had Kerren and her HOA cronies commandeered his land for their event, but they had done so with complete disregard for his rights. Determined to send a message that his property was not for public use, Jack hatched a plan that was as bold as it was unexpected. He would unleash his goats on the buffet table. Goats, known for their insatiable appetite and mischievous nature, had long been a part of Jack's farm. They were his trusted companions, helping to keep the land clear of overgrowth and providing moments of levity. Now, Jack decided they would serve as his unconventional enforcers. After a brief moment of resolve, Jack gathered his goats from their pen and released them near the buffet area. As soon as the guests and Kerren's entourage noticed, chaos erupted. The goats, with their playful yet determined energy, began nibbling on tablecloths, overturning platters, and devouring the carefully prepared food. The elegant buffet quickly devolved into a scene of pandemonium. Guests ran for cover while Kerren stood frozen, unable to control the unexpected onslaught. The incident was captured on Jack's security cameras and quickly spread throughout Cedar Valley via social media. The image of Kerren's flustered face as she tried in vain to restore order became a viral sensation. For Jack, it was a triumphant moment, a declaration that his property was his own and that he would not allow the HOA to dictate how it was used. At the next HOA meeting, held at the local community center, Jack presented the evidence. He played video clips of the goat rampage, accompanied by testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed the spectacle. "This is my way of saying that my property is not a public venue for your unauthorized events," Jack stated firmly. "When you trespass on my land and host weddings without permission, nature itself will respond." The room fell silent as board members and homeowners absorbed the undeniable proof of Kerren's repeated overreach. Even those who had once supported Kerren began to murmur in disapproval. Kerren, standing at the back of the room, tried to insist that the event was in the interest of community celebration, but her words were drowned out by the resounding applause for Jack's defiance. By the end of the meeting, the blocked exit, the unauthorized wedding, and the goat-induced chaos had transformed Jack's personal grievance into a powerful symbol of resistance, a rallying cry for every property owner in Cedar Valley who refused to have their rights trampled by arbitrary rules. That afternoon, as Jack watched his goats return to their pen, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His farm might be under siege by bureaucratic overreach, but he had taken a stand, and his creative act of defiance had ignited a spark in the community. Kerren's antics had reached a tipping point, and the message was clear. Private property is sacred, and no one will be allowed to use it without permission. Desperate to salvage her crumbling authority, Kerren resolved to launch one final, aggressive campaign against Jack's defiance. Late one evening, under the cover of darkness, Kerren gathered a small group of loyal HOA enforcers and, armed with a clipboard and a determined scowl, headed to Jack's farm with one last plan: to forcibly clear the area and reclaim her right to dictate community events. Her strategy was to call the police and report that Jack's property was being used in violation of community standards because the exit was blocked and unauthorized events were taking place. Kerren claimed that Jack's actions endangered public safety and disrupted the orderly conduct of community affairs. Determined to force Jack to remove his makeshift blockade and submit to her rules, she led her group through the darkened fields. However, Jack had anticipated further interference. His upgraded security system was fully operational, and high-definition cameras were recording every step of the intruder's approach. As Kerren's group neared the farmhouse, a loud, piercing alarm blared, triggered by motion sensors strategically placed along the perimeter. The sudden noise sent Kerren and her team into a panic. In the ensuing chaos, one of Jack's dogs barked furiously, and the enforcers scrambled to retreat. The entire incident was captured in vivid detail by Jack's security cameras, showing Kerren's enraged face, the frantic retreat of her group, and her desperate attempts to regain control. The footage was clear and damning, and it left little room for Kerren to dispute her actions. The following day, at an emergency HOA meeting held at the local community center, Jack presented the security footage to a packed room of homeowners and board members. "This footage," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "proves that Kerren's tactics are not only overreaching, they are illegal. My property is my home, and I will not allow it to be used for unauthorized events, nor will I tolerate arbitrary interference." Kerren, red-faced and visibly shaken, tried to insist that the incident was misunderstood and that she was acting in the interest of public safety. But her protests were drowned out by the mounting evidence and the resounding support for Jack's stance. The room filled with murmurs of approval and sympathetic nods as the evidence left no doubt. Kerren's final, desperate move had backfired. By the close of the meeting, it was clear that Kerren's days of unchecked authority were numbered. Her threats of further legal action and police involvement had only served to expose her as a bully willing to stoop to desperate measures. Jack's evidence had unified the community, and the legal and public backlash was now inevitable. That night, as Jack sat on his porch reviewing the footage one last time, he felt a mix of sorrow for the damage inflicted on his property and satisfaction at the progress made. He vowed to pursue every legal avenue to hold Kerren accountable for her transgressions. Her final gambit had only deepened the community's resolve to reclaim their rights, and Jack's determination to protect his legacy burned brighter than ever. In the wake of Kerren's exposed misdeeds and the overwhelming public outcry, Cedar Valley underwent a dramatic transformation. What had begun as isolated incidents of unauthorized weddings and property intrusions had evolved into a full-scale rebellion against bureaucratic tyranny. Neighbors and property owners, long oppressed by Kerren's arbitrary enforcement, began to rally together in protests, town hall meetings, and community forums to demand accountability and reclaim their rights. At a particularly impassioned community meeting held at the local civic center, residents took turns recounting their own experiences of harassment, stories of stolen property, misplaced fines, and the indignity of having their land exploited for unauthorized events. The atmosphere was charged with righteous anger and solidarity as each testimony underscored the oppressive nature of Kerren's rule. Under mounting pressure and widespread public outrage, the HOA board found itself isolated. In a historic vote broadcast live to the community, the board members, many of whom had grown disillusioned with Kerren's heavy-handed tactics, unanimously voted to remove her from her position as HOA president. The decision was met with thunderous applause, tears of relief, and an overwhelming sense of vindication. For the first time in years, residents felt empowered. Their voices had finally shattered the oppressive regime. Simultaneously, local authorities launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's practices. Auditors and legal experts uncovered a tangled web of misappropriated funds, forged documents, and systematic abuses that had enriched a select few at the expense of property owners. Headlines in local newspapers screamed, "HOA tyranny toppled," and community triumph over injustice, and the public rejoiced at the prospect of a new era. For Jack, the removal of Kerren was a deeply personal victory. His bold actions, blocking his farmhouse exit, unleashing his goats on the buffet table, and now standing up against unauthorized events, had ignited a movement that reclaimed not only his property, but also the rights of every homeowner in Cedar Valley. As he sat on his porch each evening, watching the sun cast long, golden shadows across his land, he felt a profound sense of vindication. Though his farm bore the scars of months of conflict, it now stood as a proud symbol of resilience and the power of unity. In the weeks that followed, a new democratically elected HOA was formed under leaders committed to transparency, fairness, and respect for private property. The oppressive rules and invasive practices were dismantled, replaced by guidelines that celebrated local traditions and safeguarded individual rights. Cedar Valley's collective voice had prevailed, and the dark legacy of Kerren's rule began to fade into memory. With the community united and damning evidence of Kerren's repeated violations in hand, legal authorities moved swiftly to dismantle the corrupt HOA structure. Bolstered by Jack's meticulously compiled dossier, complete with high-definition security footage, photographs of unauthorized events, and detailed logs of every transgression, the county launched an extensive investigation into the HOA's practices. The inquiry revealed a labyrinth of financial misappropriations, forged documents, and systemic abuses that had exploited property owners for years. A series of class action lawsuits was filed on behalf of the affected residents. In a landmark courtroom session, a judge scrutinized the overwhelming evidence and delivered a verdict that sent shockwaves throughout Cedar Valley. The HOA was to be dissolved immediately, its assets frozen pending further legal action, and its leadership held accountable for their crimes. The state attorney general established an independent task force to oversee the restructuring of neighborhood associations, ensuring that such abuses would never again take root. Local media exploded with the story. Headlines declared HOA tyranny dismantled and community triumph over injustice, while televised reports captured the jubilant reactions of residents who had long suffered under arbitrary fines and invasive practices. Jack's resolute stand, his creative countermeasures, and his refusal to be bullied had become a powerful symbol of resistance and accountability. The legal verdict was a resounding affirmation that no one was above the law, and that collective action could dismantle even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Former board members faced intense scrutiny, and several were indicted on charges related to fraud and extortion. The dissolution of the old HOA marked not only the end of an era of fear, but the beginning of a new chapter in community governance built on transparency, fairness, and respect for individual rights. As the legal proceedings against the corrupt HOA reached their climax, Kerren Miller's personal world began to collapse in a series of humiliating reversals. Once the self-appointed enforcer of community standards, Kerren was now exposed as a bully whose authority was built on intimidation and greed. Public scrutiny intensified as evidence of her repeated trespassing and her unauthorized use of property, including stealing prized items like Jack's prize rooster for dinner, was paraded in courtrooms and splashed across local media. Her bank accounts were frozen, and assets that had once symbolized her power were seized to cover fines and legal fees. In a final dramatic vote, the HOA board forced her resignation amid a storm of public outrage. Gossip spread like wildfire through Cedar Valley. Neighbors whispered about her ruined reputation, and headlines chronicled her fall from grace. In a bitter twist of irony, Kerren was later forced to accept a low-level position as an assistant property manager for another HOA, a body that prided itself on strict adherence to the very rules she had once flouted. One brisk morning, as Jack drove past a modest office building where Kerren now worked in plain, unassuming attire, he couldn't help but smile and murmur under his breath, "I hope you like following the rules." That wry remark quickly became the talk of the town, a final, poetic mic drop on her once dominant reign. Interviews with former board members and previously intimidated residents painted a unanimous picture. Kerren's era of tyranny was over, and her personal collapse was a powerful symbol of accountability. Her downfall served as a stark reminder that unchecked power ultimately crumbles when held accountable by a united community. For Jack, witnessing Kerren's ruin was deeply vindicating. His farm, though scarred by months of conflict, now stood as a proud monument to resilience and the triumph of justice over oppression. Every stolen asset and every unauthorized act had been recorded and used to dismantle her reign. Kerren's fall had become a symbol of the community's reclaimed rights, a testament to Jack's unwavering determination to protect his home and legacy. In the months following the dissolution of the corrupt HOA and Kerren's dramatic downfall, Cedar Valley began to heal. The oppressive shadow of arbitrary fines and invasive practices gave way to a renewed sense of unity and empowerment. Jack's farm, now secure and thriving under his careful stewardship, stood as a living testament to the power of resilience and the sanctity of private property. At a festive community picnic held on a crisp autumn afternoon, neighbors gathered to mark the dawn of a new era, one defined by fairness, transparency, and respect for individual rights. Laughter filled the open fields as families enjoyed home-cooked meals and children played around the barns. In a particularly humorous moment, a local artist unveiled a satirical mural depicting a red-faced Kerren being forced off a property by a herd of goats, an irreverent final mic drop on her oppressive reign. Seated on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, Jack watched the festivities with quiet satisfaction. The painful memories of stolen property and invasive trespassing had given way to hope and collective empowerment. When a longtime friend handed him a mock HOA violation notice for excessive trespassing on private property, Jack smirked and replied, "They really tried." In that serene moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed Cedar Valley in warm, golden hues, the legacy of Kerren's oppressive rule faded into memory. The community had reclaimed its rights, and Jack's steadfast defense of his home had become a powerful reminder that true power lies not in enforcing conformity, but in standing up for one's property and heritage. Fade to black.